Medieval times or Middle Ages, the period in European history from the collapse of Roman civilization in the 5th century to the period of the Renaissance, variously interpreted as beginning in the 13th, 14th, or 15th century, depending on the region of Europe and other factors. The term and its conventional meaning were introduced by Italian humanists with invidious intent. The humanists were engaged in a revival of classical learning and culture, and the notion of a 1,000-year period of darkness and ignorance separating them from the ancient Greek and Roman worlds served to highlight the humanists' own work and ideals. It would seem unnecessary to observe that the men and women who lived during the 1,000 years or so preceding the Renaissance were not conscious of living in the Middle Ages. A few, Petrarch was the most conspicuous among them, felt that their lot was cast in a dark time, which had begun with the decline of the Roman Empire. Indeed, Petrarch would provide something of a founding statement for the humanists when he wrote, "For who can doubt that Rome would rise again instantly if she began to know herself?" In a sense, the humanists invented the Middle Ages in order to distinguish themselves from it. They were making a gesture of their sense of freedom, and yet, at the same time, they were implicitly accepting the medieval conception of history as a series of well-defined ages within a limited framework of time. They did not speak of Augustine's 6 ages of the world or believe in the chronology of Joachimite prophecy, but they nevertheless inherited a philosophy of history that began with the Garden of Eden and would end with the second coming of Christ. In such a scheme, the 1,000 years from the 5th to the 15th century might well be regarded as a distinct respectable period of history, which would stand out clearly in the providential pattern. Throughout European history, however, there has never been a complete breach with medieval institutions or modes of thought. The sack of Rome by Alaric the Visigoth in 410 CE had enormous impact on the political structure and social climate of the Western world, for the Roman Empire had provided the basis of social cohesion for most of Europe. Although the Germanic tribes that forcibly migrated into southern and western Europe in the 5th century were ultimately converted to Christianity, they retained many of their customs and ways of life. The changes in forms of social organization they introduced rendered centralized government and cultural unity impossible. Many of the improvements in the quality of life introduced during the Roman Empire, such as a relatively efficient agriculture, extensive road networks, water supply systems, and shipping routes, decayed substantially, as did artistic and scholarly endeavors. This decline persisted throughout the migration period, a historical period sometimes called the Dark Ages, Late Antiquity, or the Early Middle Ages. The migration period lasted from the fall of Rome to about the year 1000, with a brief hiatus during the flowering of the Carolingian court established by Charlemagne. Apart from that interlude, no large political structure arose in Europe to provide stability. 2 great kingdoms, Germany and Italy, began to lose their political unity almost as soon as they had acquired it. They had to wait until the 19th century before they found it again. The only force capable of providing a basis for social unity was the Roman Catholic Church. The Middle Ages therefore present the confusing and often contradictory picture of a society attempting to structure itself politically on a spiritual basis. This attempt came to a definitive end with the rise of artistic, commercial, and other activities anchored firmly in the secular world in the period just preceding the Renaissance. After the dissolution of the Roman Empire, the idea arose of Europe as one large church-state, called Christendom. Christendom was thought to consist of 2 distinct groups of functionaries: the sacerdotium or ecclesiastical hierarchy, and the imperium or secular leaders. In theory, these 2 groups complemented each other, attending to people's spiritual and temporal needs, respectively. Supreme authority was wielded by the Pope in the first of these areas and by the Emperor in the second. In practice, the 2 institutions were constantly sparring, disagreeing, or openly warring with each other. The emperors often tried to regulate church activities by claiming the right to appoint church officials and to intervene in doctrinal matters. The church, in turn, not only owned cities and armies but often attempted to regulate affairs of state. This tension would reach a breaking point in the late 11th and early 12th centuries during the clash between Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII over the question of lay investiture. During the 12th century, a cultural and economic revival took place. Many historians trace the origins of the Renaissance to this time. The balance of economic power slowly began to shift from the region of the Eastern Mediterranean to Western Europe. The Gothic style developed in art and architecture. Towns began to flourish, travel and communication became faster, safer, and easier, and merchant classes began to develop. Agricultural developments were one reason for these developments. During the 12th century, the cultivation of beans made a balanced diet available to all social classes for the first time in history. The population therefore rapidly expanded, a factor that eventually led to the breakup of the old feudal structures. The breakup of feudal structures, the strengthening of city-states in Italy, and the emergence of national monarchies in Spain, France, and England, as well as such cultural developments as the rise of secular education, culminated in the birth of a self-consciously new age with a new spirit, one that looked all the way back to classical learning for its inspiration and that came to be known as the Renaissance. Black Death. Black Death, pandemic that ravaged Europe between 1347 and 1351, taking a proportionately greater toll of life than any other known epidemic or war up to that time. It is estimated that 25 million people died. The Black Death is widely believed to have been the result of plague, caused by infection with the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Modern genetic analyses indicate that the strain of Y. pestis introduced during the Black Death is ancestral to all extant circulating Y. pestis strains known to cause disease in humans. Hence, the origin of modern plague epidemics lies in the medieval period. Other scientific evidence has indicated that the Black Death may have been viral in origin. Having originated in China and Inner Asia, the Black Death decimated the army of the Kipchak Khan Janibeg while he was besieging the Genoese trading port of Kaffa, now Feodosia, in Crimea, 1347. With his forces disintegrating, Janibeg used trebuchets to catapult plague-infested corpses into the town in an effort to infect his enemies. From Kaffa, Genoese ships carried the epidemic westward to Mediterranean ports, whence it spread inland, affecting Sicily, 1347, North Africa, mainland Italy, Spain and France, 1348, and Austria, Hungary, Switzerland, Germany and the Low Countries, 1349. A ship from Calais carried the plague to Melcombe Regis, Dorset, in August 1348. It reached Bristol almost immediately and spread rapidly throughout the southwestern counties of England. London suffered most violently between February and May 1349, East Anglia and Yorkshire during that summer. The Black Death reached the extreme north of England, Scotland, Scandinavia, and the Baltic countries in 1350. There were recurrences of the plague in 1361–63, 1369–71, 1374–75, 1390, and 1400. Modern research has suggested that, over that period of time, plague was introduced into Europe multiple times, coming along trade routes in waves from Central Asia as a result of climate fluctuations that affected populations of rodents infested with plague-carrying fleas. The rate of mortality from the Black Death varied from place to place, whereas some districts such as the Duchy of Milan, Flanders and Béarn seemed to have escaped comparatively lightly. Others, such as Tuscany, Aragon, Catalonia and Languedoc, were very hard hit. Towns, where the danger of contagion was greater, were more affected than the countryside, and within the towns the monastic communities provided the highest incidence of victims. Even the great and powerful who were more capable of flight were struck down. Among royalty, Eleanor, Queen of Peter IV of Aragon, and King Alfonso XI of Castile succumbed, and Joan, daughter of the English King Edward III, died at Bordeaux on the way to her wedding with Alfonso's son. Canterbury lost two successive archbishops, John de Stratford and Thomas Bradwardine. Petrarch lost not only Laura, who inspired so many of his poems, but also his patron, Giovanni Cardinal Colonna. The papal court at Avignon was reduced by 1/4. Whole communities and families were sometimes annihilated. The consequences of this violent catastrophe were many. A cessation of wars and a sudden slump in trade immediately followed, but were only of short duration. A more lasting and serious consequence was the drastic reduction of the amount of land under cultivation, due to the deaths of so many laborers. This proved to be the ruin of many landowners. The shortage of labor compelled them to substitute wages or money rents in place of labor services in an effort to keep their tenants. There was also a general rise in wages for artisans and peasants. These changes brought a new fluidity to the hitherto rigid stratification of society. The psychological effects of the Black Death were reflected north of the Alps, not in Italy, by a preoccupation with death and the afterlife evinced in poetry, sculpture, and painting. The Roman Catholic Church lost some of its monopoly over the salvation of souls as people turned to mysticism and sometimes to excesses. Anti-Semitism greatly intensified throughout Europe, as Jews were blamed for the spread of the Black Death. A wave of violent pogroms ensued, and entire Jewish communities were killed by mobs or burned at the stake en masse. The economy of Siena received a decisive check. The city's population was so diminished that the project of enlarging the cathedral was abandoned, and the death of many great painters, such as Ambrogio and Pietro Lorenzetti, brought the development of the first Sienese school to a premature end. In England, the immediate effects of the epidemic of 1349 seem to have been of short duration, and the economic decline which reached its nadir in the mid-15th century should probably be attributed rather to the pandemic recurrence of the plague. The study of contemporary archives suggests a mortality varying in the different regions between 1/8 and 2/3 of the population, and the French chronicler Jean Froissart's statement that about 1/3 of Europe's population died in the epidemic may be fairly accurate. The population in England in 1400 was perhaps half what it had been 100 years earlier. In that country alone, the Black Death certainly caused the depopulation or total disappearance of about 1,000 villages. A rough estimate is that 25 million people in Europe died from plague during the Black Death. The population of Western Europe did not again reach its pre-1348 level until the beginning of the 16th century. Crusades, military expeditions, beginning in the late 11th century, that were organized by Western European Christians in response to centuries of Muslim wars of expansion. Their objectives were to check the spread of Islam, to retake control of the Holy Land in the Eastern Mediterranean, to conquer pagan areas, and to recapture formerly Christian territories. They were seen by many of their participants as a means of redemption and expiation for sins. Between 1095, when the First Crusade was launched, and 1291, when the Latin Christians were finally expelled from their kingdom in Syria, there were numerous expeditions to the Holy Land, to Spain, and even to the Baltic. The Crusades continued for several centuries after 1291. Crusading declined rapidly during the 16th century with the advent of the Protestant Reformation and the decline of papal authority. Approximately 2/3 of the ancient Christian world had been conquered by Muslims by the end of the 11th century, including the important regions of Palestine, Syria, Egypt, and Anatolia. The Crusades, attempting to check this advance, initially enjoyed success, founding a Christian state in Palestine and Syria, but the continued growth of Islamic states ultimately reversed those gains. By the 14th century, the Ottoman Turks had established themselves in the Balkans and would penetrate deeper into Europe despite repeated efforts to repulse them. Although still backward when compared with the other civilizations of the Mediterranean basin, Western Europe had become a significant power by the end of the 11th century. It was composed of several kingdoms loosely describable as feudal. While endemic private warfare, brigandage, and problems associated with vassalage and inheritance still existed, some monarchies were already developing better integrated systems of government. At the same time, Europe was feeling the effects of population growth that had begun toward the end of the 10th century and would continue well into the 13th century. An economic revival was also in full swing well before the First Crusade. Forest lands were being cleared, frontiers pushed forward, and markets organized. Moreover, Italian shipping was beginning to challenge the Muslim predominance in the Mediterranean. Especially significant for the Crusade was a general overhaul of the ecclesiastical structure in the 11th century, associated with the Gregorian reform movement, which enabled the popes to assume a more active role in society. In 1095, for example, Urban II was in a position strong enough to convoke two important ecclesiastical councils, despite meeting resistance from Henry IV, the German emperor, who opposed papal reform policies. Thus it was that, in the closing years of the 11th century, Western Europe was abounding in energy and confidence. What is more, as is evident in achievements such as the Norman conquest of England in 1066, Europeans possessed the capacity to launch a major military undertaking at the very time the Seljuk Turks, one of several tribes on the northeastern frontier of the Muslim world who had embraced Islam in the 11th century, were beginning to move south and west into Iran and beyond with all the enthusiasm of a new convert. The Crusades were also a development of popular religious life and feeling in Europe, particularly in Western Europe. The social effect of religious belief at the time was complex. Religion was moved by tales of signs and wonders, and it attributed natural disasters to supernatural intervention. At the same time, laypersons were not indifferent to reform movements, and on occasion they agitated against clergy whom they regarded as unworthy. A peace movement also developed, especially in France, under the leadership of certain bishops but with considerable popular support. Religious leaders proclaimed the peace of God and the truce of God, designed to halt or at least limit warfare and assaults during certain days of the week and times of the year, and to protect the lives of clergy, travelers, women, and cattle and others unable to defend themselves against brigandage. It is particularly interesting to note that the Council of Clermont, at which Urban II called for the First Crusade, 1095, renewed and generalized the peace of God. It may seem paradoxical that a council both promulgated peace and officially sanctioned war, but the peace movement was designed to protect those in distress, and a strong element of the crusade was the idea of giving aid to fellow Christians in the East. Tied to this idea was the notion that war to defend Christendom was not only a justifiable undertaking but a holy work, and therefore pleasing to God. Closely associated with this Western concept of holy war was another popular religious practice: pilgrimage to a holy shrine. 11th century Europe abounded in local shrines housing relics of saints, but three great centers of pilgrimage stood out above the others: Rome, with the tombs of Saints Peter and Paul; Santiago de Compostela, in northwestern Spain; and Jerusalem, with the Holy Sepulchre of Jesus Christ's entombment. Pilgrimage, which had always been considered an act of devotion, had also come to be regarded as a more formal expiation for serious sin, even occasionally prescribed as a penance for the sinner by his confessor. Yet another element in the popular religious consciousness of the 11th century, one associated with both crusade and pilgrimage, was the belief that the end of the world was imminent. See also eschatology and millennialism. Some scholars have discovered evidence of apocalyptic expectations around the years 1033, the millennium of the birth and passion of Jesus, respectively, and others have emphasized the continuance of the idea throughout the 11th century and beyond. Moreover, in certain late 11th century portrayals of the end of all things, the last emperor, now popularly identified with the King of the Franks, the final successor of Charlemagne, was to lead the faithful to Jerusalem to await the second coming of Christ. Jerusalem, as the earthly symbol of the heavenly city, figured prominently in Western Christian consciousness, and as the number of pilgrimages to Jerusalem increased in the 11th century, it became clear that any interruption of access to the city would have serious repercussions. By the middle of the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks had wrested political authority from the Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad. Seljuk policy, originally directed southward against the Fimids of Egypt, was increasingly diverted by the pressure of Turkmen raids into Anatolia and Byzantine Armenia. A Byzantine army was defeated and Emperor Romanus IV Diogenes was captured at Manzikert in 1071, and Christian Asia Minor was thereby open to eventual Turkish occupation. Meanwhile, many Armenians south of the Caucasus migrated south to join others in the region of the Taurus Mountains and to form a colony in Cilicia. Seljuk expansion southward continued, and in 1085 the capture of Antioch in Syria, one of the patriarchal sees of Christianity, was another blow to Byzantine prestige. Thus, although the Seljuk Empire never successfully held together as a unit, it appropriated most of Asia Minor, including Nicaea, from the Byzantine Empire and brought a resurgent Islam perilously close to Constantinople, the Byzantine capital. It was this danger that prompted the emperor, Alexius Comnenus, to seek aid from the West, and by 1095 the West was ready to respond. The turmoil of these years disrupted normal political life and made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem difficult and often impossible. Stories of dangers and molestation reached the West and remained in the popular mind even after conditions improved. Furthermore, Informed authorities began to realize that the power of the Muslim world now seriously menaced the West as well as the East. It was this realization that led to the Crusades. Alexius's appeal came at a time when relations between the eastern and western branches of the Christian world were improving. Difficulties between the two in the middle years of the century had resulted in a de facto, though not formally proclaimed, schism in 1054, and ecclesiastical disagreements had been accentuated by Norman occupation of formerly Byzantine areas in southern Italy. A campaign led by the Norman adventurer Robert Guiscard against the Greek mainland further embittered the Byzantines, and it was only after Robert's death in 1085 that conditions for a renewal of normal relations between East and West were reasonably favorable. Envoys of Emperor Alexius Comnenus thus arrived at the Council of Piacenza in 1095 at a propitious moment, and it seems probable that Pope Urban II viewed military aid as a means toward restoring ecclesiastical unity. The Council of Clermont, convoked by Urban on November 18, 1095, was attended largely by bishops of southern France as well as a few representatives from northern France and elsewhere. Much important ecclesiastical business was transacted, which resulted in a series of canons, among them one that renewed the peace of God and another that granted a plenary indulgence, the remission of all penance for sin, to those who undertook to aid Christians in the East. Then in a great outdoor assembly the Pope, a Frenchman, addressed a large crowd. His exact words will never be known, since the only surviving accounts of his speech were written years later, but he apparently stressed the plight of Eastern Christians, the molestation of pilgrims, and the desecration of the holy places. He urged those who were guilty of disturbing the peace to turn their warlike energies toward a holy cause. He emphasized the need for penance along with the acceptance of suffering, and taught that no one should undertake this pilgrimage for any but the most exalted of motives. The response was immediate and overwhelming, probably far greater than Urban had anticipated. Cries of Deus le vult, God wills it, were heard everywhere, and it was decided that those who agreed to go should wear a cross. Moreover, it was not only warrior knights who responded. A popular element, apparently unexpected and probably not desired, also came forward. The era of Clermont witnessed the concurrence of three significant developments. First, there existed as never before a popular religious fervor that was not without marked eschatological tendencies in which the holy city of Jerusalem figured prominently. Second, war against the infidel had come to be regarded as a religious undertaking, a work pleasing to God, and finally, Western Europe now possessed the ecclesiastical and secular institutional and organizational capacity to plan such an enterprise and carry it through. Following Pope Urban's speech, preparations began in both East and West. Emperor Alexius, who had doubtless anticipated the mustering of some sort of auxiliary force, apparently soon realized that he would have to provide for and police a much larger influx of warriors. In the West, as the leaders began to assemble their armies, those who took the cross sought to raise money, often by selling or mortgaging property, both for the immediate purchase of equipment and for the long-term needs of the journey. As preparations were underway, several less organized bands of knights and peasants, commonly known as the People's Crusade, set out across Europe. The most famous of these, brought together by a remarkable popular preacher, Peter the Hermit, and his associate Walter Sansevouar, reached Constantinople after having caused considerable disorder in Hungary and Bulgaria. Alexius received Peter cordially and advised him to await the arrival of the main crusade force. But the rank and file grew unruly, and on August 6, 1096, they were ferried across the Bosporus. While Peter was in Constantinople requesting additional aid, his army was ambushed at Civitas, called Civitate by the Crusaders, and all but annihilated by the Turks. Peter the Hermit's preaching in Germany inspired other groups of crusaders, who also failed to reach Jerusalem. One of these groups was led by the notorious Count Emicho and was responsible for a series of pogroms, or massacres, of Jews in several Rhenish towns in 1096. Traditionally recognized as an important turning point in Jewish and Christian relations in the Middle Ages. In fact, it is often cited as a pivotal moment in the history of antisemitism. These attacks occurred first in Speyer and then with increasing ferocity in Worms, Mainz, and Cologne. The Jews of these towns often sought, and sometimes received, the protection of the bishop or futilely took refuge in local homes and temples. Forced by the Crusaders to convert or die, many Jews chose death. There are accounts of Jews committing suicide and even killing their children rather than converting or submitting to execution by the Crusaders. Though zealotry of this nature is not unique to Christianity, these massacres did not go unnoticed even by fellow Christians. Indeed, some contemporary Christian accounts attributed the defeat of the People's Crusade to them. After the massacres, the Crusaders moved on to Hungary, where they were routed by the Hungarian king and suffered heavy losses. Emmy Cho, who may not have participated in all the pogroms, escaped and returned home in disgrace. The main crusading force, which departed in August 1096 as Urban directed, consisted of 4 major contingents. A smaller, 5th force, led by Hugh of Vermandois, brother of King Philip I of France, left before the others but was reduced by shipwreck while crossing the Adriatic from Bari to Dyrrhachium, now Durrës, Albania. Godfrey of Bouillon, leader of the first large army to depart and Duke of Lower Lorraine since 1087, was the only major prince from the German kingdom involved in the crusade, though he and his associates largely spoke French. Joined by his brothers Eustace and Baldwin, and a kinsman, Baldwin of Libourg, Godfrey took the land route and crossed Hungary without incident. Markets and provisions were supplied in Byzantine territory, and except for some pillaging, the army reached Constantinople without serious problems on December 23, 1096. A second force was organized by Bohemond, a Norman from southern Italy. The son of Robert Guiscard, Bohemond was on familiar ground across the Adriatic, where he had fought with his father and was understandably feared by the Byzantines. However, he was 40 years old when he arrived at Constantinople on April 9, 1097, and determined to come to profitable terms with his former enemy. The third and largest army was assembled by Raymond of St. Gilles, the Count of Toulouse. At age 55, he was the oldest and most prominent of the princes on the crusade, and he aspired and perhaps expected to become the leader of the entire expedition. He was accompanied by Adhemer, Bishop of Le Puy, whom the Pope had named as legate for the crusade. Raymond led his followers, including a number of non-combatant pilgrims whom he supported at his own expense, across northern Italy, around the head of the Adriatic Sea, and then southward into Byzantine territory. This large body caused considerable trouble in Dalmatia and clashed with Byzantine troops as it approached the capital, where Raymond arrived on April 21. Meanwhile, the Fourth Army, under Robert of Flanders, had crossed the Adriatic from Brindisi. Accompanying Robert were his cousin Robert of Normandy, brother of King William II of England, and Stephen of Blois, the son-in-law of William the Conqueror. No king took part in the First Crusade, and the predominantly French-speaking participants came to be known by the Muslims as Franks. The presence near Constantinople of massive military forces, numbering perhaps 4,000 mounted knights and 25,000 infantry, posed a serious problem for Alexius, and there was occasional disorder. Forced to consider imperial interests, which, it soon became evident, were different from the objective of the Crusaders, the emperor required each crusade leader to promise under oath to restore to him any conquered territory that had belonged to the empire before the Turkish invasions and to swear loyalty to him while the Crusaders remained in his domain. Since there was never any plan for the crusade to go beyond the far-flung borders of the old Roman Empire, this would effectively give all conquests to the emperor. Only Bohemond willingly took the emperor's oath. The others did so under duress, and Raymond swore only a lukewarm oath to respect the property and person of the emperor. Despite this, Raymond and Alexius became good friends, and Raymond remained the strongest defender of the emperor's rights throughout the crusade. Late in May 1097, the Crusaders and a contingent of Byzantine soldiers reached the capital of the Turkish Sultanate, Nicaea, now Iznik, Turkey, which surrendered to the Byzantines on June 19. The Crusade army left Nicaea for Antioch on June 26 and found crossing the arid and mountainous Anatolia difficult. At Dorylaeum on July 1, 1097, Turks attacked the advance column of the Crusader army. Despite the heat and a rain of arrows, the Crusaders held their ground, and when the rest of the army drew up, the Turks were routed. A major victory in open warfare had been achieved by cooperation between the separate western contingents and the Greeks. Further advance across Anatolia was even more arduous, and it was only after suffering many casualties, especially in the region of the Taurus Mountains, that the Crusaders arrived near Antioch on October 20th. Meanwhile, Godfrey's brother Baldwin left the main army to involve himself in Armenian politics and then became ruler of Edessa. The first of the Crusader states, the county of Edessa would provide a valuable buffer against Turkish attacks on Antioch and other Christian territories. One of the great cities of the Levant and one of the patriarchal sees of Christianity, Antioch was surrounded by an enormous circle of walls studded with more than 400 towers. Despite reinforcements and supplies from Genoese and English ships and later from the Patriarch of Jerusalem, then in Cyprus, the siege proved long and difficult, and many died of starvation or disease. Spring brought the threat of counterattack by a relief force under Kerboga of Mosul. The situation seemed so hopeless that some crusaders deserted and attempted to return home. Among these was Peter the Hermit, who was caught and returned to the host, where he was quietly forgiven. Another deserter was the French knight Stephen of Blois, who was cut off from the main body of the army by Kerboga's forces and judged, not unreasonably, that the Crusaders were doomed. On his way home Stephen met Alexius, who was marching at the head of a Byzantine relief force, and convinced him that Antioch's cause was hopeless. The emperor's decision to turn back, however justified tactically, was a diplomatic blunder. When the Crusaders learned of the emperor's move, they felt free from any obligation to return the city to him. Bohemond, meanwhile, proposed that the first to enter the city should have possession of it, provided the emperor did not make an appearance. The Norman had, in fact, already made contact with a discontented commander within, who proceeded to admit him over a section of the walls on June 3, 1098. The other Crusaders followed Bohemond into the dozing city and quickly captured it. Only the citadel held out. Thus, Antioch was restored to Christian rule. The victory, however, was incomplete. Kerboga arrived with an enormous Turkish army and completely invested the city, which was already very low on provisions. Once again the situation seemed hopeless. Disagreements between the leaders persisted and were accentuated by arguments over the validity of what had come to be called the Holy Lance, which a Provençal priest found below the cathedral and insisted was the lance that, according to the Gospels, had pierced the side of Jesus Christ when he hung on the cross. Nonetheless, on June 28, the Crusader army moved out of the city. The Turkish forces were not of high quality and had only tenuous loyalty to Kerboga. When they saw the size of the Crusade forces and the resolve of the men, the Turks began to flee. With the evaporation of Kerboga's army, the citadel finally surrendered to Bohemond, and its garrison was permitted to leave. Rejoicing was tempered by a devastating epidemic that took many lives, including that of the legate, Adhemer of Le Puy, who, as the spiritual leader of the crusade, had been a wise counselor and a stabilizing influence whom the leaders could ill afford to lose. The crusade leaders then fell into violent disagreement over the final disposition of Antioch. Bohemond, who had been responsible for the capture of the city and then had led its defense, wanted it for himself. Raymond, however, insisted that it be returned to the emperor. Unable to come to terms on Antioch, Bohemond and Raymond refused to march to Jerusalem, which effectively stalled the crusade. The leaders agreed to depart only after the rank and file threatened to tear down the walls of Antioch. On January 13, 1099, the army then set out for Jerusalem under the leadership of Raymond of St. Gilles. As they moved south, Tancred and Robert of Normandy and later, Godfrey and Robert of Flanders joined them. Bohemond, ignoring his previous oaths, remained in Antioch. Not far from Beirut, the army entered the territory of the Fatimid caliphs of Cairo, who, as Shia Muslims, were enemies of the Sunni Seljuks and the caliphs of Baghdad. In August 1098, the Fatimids had occupied Jerusalem. The final drive of the First Crusade, therefore, was against the Fatimids of Egypt, not the Seljuks. On June 7, 1099, the Christian army, by then considerably reduced to perhaps 1,200 to 1,500 cavalry and 12,000 foot soldiers, encamped before Jerusalem, whose governor was well supplied and confident that he could withstand a siege until a relief force arrived from Egypt. The Crusaders, on the other hand, were short of supplies and would be until 6 vessels arrived at Jaffa, Yaffo, and managed to unload before the port was blockaded by an Egyptian squadron. On July 8 a strict fast was ordered, and with the Muslims scoffing from the walls, the entire army, preceded by the clergy, marched in solemn procession around the city, thence to the Mount of Olives, where Peter the Hermit preached with his former eloquence. Siege towers were carried up to the walls on July 13 to 14, and on July 15 Godfrey's men took a sector of the walls, and others followed on scaling ladders. When the nearest gate was opened, Tancred and Raymond entered, and the Muslim governor surrendered to the latter in the Tower of David. The governor, along with his bodyguard, was escorted out of the city. Tancred promised protection in the Ak Mosque, but his orders were disobeyed. Hundreds of men, women, and children, both Muslim and Jewish, perished in the general slaughter that followed. The Crusaders, therefore, attained their goal 3 long years after they had set out.